Blimey. Ooh, this is one hell of a jam jar you got here.
Warning. The House of Mystery contains demons, angels, elementals, magicians, wizards, apparitions, adult language, and discussions. If you're easily offended, do not enter the House of Mystery.
All right, then. On with the show.
All right, hello, welcome everyone to the House of Mystery, the John Constantine and Friends podcast. I am your host, Michael Flores, and curator of the House of Horrors. And in the House of Mystery, on cleanup duty, is the demon bisexual butler, David Sabal. Hello, David.
Hello, everybody.
How are you today?
Doing fantastic, because you know what? I have been waiting for us to cover this for a very long time.
We've been talking about it for quite a while, and we've never managed to get to it for whatever reason. But now, today, we're finally here. We're going to be talking about Hellblazer Volume 1. But first, if you're a new listener to our shows, I welcome you to this shit show we call the House of Mystery. We cover a wide variety of Constantine and related content. You can find this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search House of Mystery. iTunes and Spotify are our preferred feeds due to their rating and review system. So please leave a review on those platforms. And also, please bear with some of the audio issues we're having.
We're having our own Nurgles show up and mess up the studio.
The studio is located in Arizona, and as soon as it gets warm, which, yes, it's already getting warm here in Arizona, the studio equipment acts up because we don't have all the ventilation and fans that we should have. So every once in a while, the board will go out. So I apologize. Unfortunately, we are a low-budget operation, despite the fact that we have thousands of dollars of equipment. We just can't always maintain it appropriately. So I do apologize, and please be patient. Okay, David. So in this episode, we are going way back to Jamie Delano's Hellblazer run with a deep dive and analysis of Hellblazer Volume 1, Original Sins.
Dude, this is the title that made me a comic book, like, absolute slave.
Yeah.
Because during 1988 was when I started getting a lot into more... mature is probably
the darker side.
Darker side.
Yeah.
You got more titles out there, out in like the mainstream, even with DC Comics, that basically broadened the horizon from what John would call the capes.
Yeah.
You got like great titles from, and especially during that time, because you had the seminal like writers in comic book history hit the ground running. You had Frank Miller, you had Alan Moore, you had Warren Ellis peeking around. You had Jamie Delano, who is so unsung about during that time frame.
Yeah.
But without him, we would not have the Hellblazer we know today.
Nope. Absolutely. Now, David, Volume 1 of Hellblazer is comprised of Hellblazer issues 1 through 9 and Constantine's first official introduction into DC canon within Swamp Thing 76 and 77. Now, we plan to take our time with Volume 1. I have no interest in rushing through the entire volume in one episode discussion. So our plan is to take a little time, and we're going to go through this little by little. That could mean we will cover one issue or two or three in one episode. It just depends on the material, the specific content in those issues.
Oh, yeah.
Now, for this specific discussion, we are going to talk exclusively about issue number 1, and that is it.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Yep, and any necessary back information needed for context. And I figured this way we have something Hellblazer to discuss during this podcast season as we plan to delve into Volume 1 throughout the year.
Well, there's a lot to cover, especially in the very beginning when this issue first hit the ground, like fully on the newsstands. People didn't know what to make of it because, like, number one, it was coming from DC Comics, but it was coming from Vertigo.
It wasn't Vertigo yet.
or not Vertigo yet, but it was coming from like
A
basically
horror
like
imprint.
the horror imprint for DC. So no one really knew what to make of it.
Yeah.
There wasn't going to be any superheroes tied to it. So what was the thing that was going to bring the audience in? The only thing that people were actually saying, "Oh, John Constantine's in it." And during that time, Constantine was known because of the work Alan Moore did with Swamp Thing. And everyone was like going, "Okay, well, we know that character from this title. Let's see what they do with him in a fully fledged title."
Yeah. It was definitely a new area for DC Comics.
Yeah.
Now, I want to preface that we will probably dissect these issues in a way that new readers can follow along as well. There will be spoilers, but we will try and explain things and discuss them as if they're new.
Yes.
Okay, David, so let's start with some background first in Volume 1 as a whole. Hellblazer Volume 1, Number 1, dropped January 1988. 1988.
Yes.
Hellblazer was an ongoing series started by Jamie Delano. With the launch of DC's 52 Hellblazer, it was the longest ongoing monthly series without renumbering or cancellations / rebirths from the big two. When I say big two, I'm of course talking about Marvel and DC, which to this day they have a habit of starting over, whereas with Hellblazer, it didn't. And that's why it became one of the longest ongoing monthly series to date. Now, Hellblazer was known as Vertigo's longest-running comics, as it actually started 5 years before Vertigo was a publisher at DC, and it was the last Vertigo title to be canceled. How sad is that?
Yes.
The first and the last.
And the last.
Very appropriate, though. Sad, but appropriate. The edition or collection we are using to discuss is a newer edition that includes Constantine's appearance in Swamp Thing, as I had said a few moments ago. This first collection is a loosely connected series of tales of John's early years where Constantine was at his best and his worst, all at the same time.
Yes.
So just to reiterate, Jamie Delano was the writer that initially took Hellblazer to new heights.
Yes.
Rick Veitch, John Ridgway, Alfredo Alcala, and Tom Mandrake round out the creative team and artists involved in this initial run as well. And we cannot forget them because the art is just as mesmerizing as the writing itself.
It is. It is. I mean, especially like the coloring in these titles is like it's a lost art. It really is, because like you can definitely see like the
I agree. I actually have that in my notes, Dave. I agree with you.
You don't see this type of art anymore because there's so much detail and shadowing and contrast that goes into the thought process of all these panels.
There's also things that they're doing that they weren't necessarily doing in this time in comic books. There was more of an experimental vibe to some of these panels.
Yeah.
And sure, the horror imprint that was used, I want to say, since the 50s when it comes to DC's darker side, either the 50s or the early 60s, I can't quite remember. They did do a lot more experimental things. They were willing to take more risk on that imprint.
Yes.
But it wasn't really until Constantine's run that we really got to see these artists shine and have a certain amount of freedom to do things that possibly wouldn't work in the regular titles on the DC imprint itself.
Oh yeah, because like when you take a look at the art here, me and you have covered like the current Hellblazer run that was done by Spurrier. That art in there was just gorgeous. It was museum quality art, and it was slightly experimental, but it focused.
Some of Aaron Campbell's stuff was
out there.
beyond experimental.
But there's a difference between nowadays when artists decide to go experimental, and here back in it's sad for me to say, back in the 80s, where they were doing experimental things. They were doing experimental things to focus and push the narrative and not just rely on the words of the writer or rely on the dialogue bubbles, but they wanted to actually, artists started actually doing more and more with, you know, like trying to convey what the writer is trying to say with his themes.
Yeah.
And during the 80s, that's when you started seeing, you know, like artists coming out of nowhere. You know, as much as I give a lot of flack to Frank Miller did some amazing experimentation that set the standard for themes in certain books. The reason why Batman is the way he is and the way he's portrayed is because Frank Miller took those experimentations with his art.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's our setup for this discussion, and it's time to get into the issue itself. So issue 1 does just about everything right.
Yeah.
I do have to share that I have not read the first issue of Hellblazer in years, possibly decades. The late 90s, maybe the early 2000s, perhaps.
Yeah.
Is the last time I cracked open anything remotely from the early days of Constantine. There are things I have forgotten, and as I read, there are things that instantly came back. I was like, oh yes, I remember.
Well,
and there are also things just in this first issue, Dave, that I didn't realize was introduced so early on, like
Yes.
almost immediately. I'm like, Chaz, I forgot he was in the very
He
first
was in
issue.
the first issue, yep. And Papa Midnight.
And that's
Papa
another one.
Midnight
I
is
had
another one.
forgotten that Papa Midnight was introduced from the very beginning of Hellblazer.
And the thing that I love about this era or this time frame of Hellblazer was like in today's world, when they try to do horror or suspense comics, they focus on gore. They focus on the shock factor. They focus on the, you know, pop up and surprise you type of scare factor, right?
Yeah.
Dude, this first issue starts off with, to me, the two most demented and twisted death scenes ever. The guy in the very beginning who dies of gluttony and still just withers away. And he's just eating, and it shows that like this grotesque feeling of like him eating the cheeseburger.
Yeah. And he becomes emaciated. Yeah.
And he becomes emaciated. But then later, the bug scene, where the guy is sitting in the tub covered in bugs.
It's uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable.
I will say I do like that you brought that up because
You don't see that anymore. You really don't.
No, you're right. And I'm not against gore necessarily, but if you're just using gore to sell your fear,
gore's sake.
then that's not really a fear tactic. That's you just cheating by showing gore. You are right. When it comes to this, it isn't necessarily about the gore. It's about the very uncomfortable atmosphere that's created, the aesthetics of this world that we find ourselves in. That's what's truly disturbing. You know, seeing what's going bump in the night. The idea that this, you know, Sudan medicine man,
Yes.
you know, chooses a sacrifice that's a child in order to ensnare and trap this demon. You know, yes, it's an awful thing when you think about what he did, but it was also for the greater good.
It's for the greater good.
In order to save his village and save the world, essentially, from this demon spirit, he chooses a child to use as a bit of a prison for this demon. So just the content as well is uncomfortable and very unsettling. And when it comes down to horror, that to me is what horror really is. It isn't about the fear tactics necessarily or the imagery all the time. Sometimes it's about the atmosphere, the feeling that you create with your imagery and with your gore.
Yeah. And especially, you know, like even with those two elements, the moment that they still have room to make you feel uncomfortable in the middle, telling their story of like I think is it Zed?
Yeah.
I think it's Zed. Zed ends up.
Oh, Gary.
Oh, Gary. Gary ends up actually hotshotting a demonic presence into his body like a drug.
Awesome.
And I'm like going, are you kidding me? And the panels, dude, showing him how he takes the thing and he treats it like it's a drug.
Well, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Content. The content is uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable.
I mean, David, we're talking about 1988, and they're putting drug use in a comic.
In front and center.
Yeah.
And then on top of that,
That's ballsy back then. That's ballsy
Absolutely.
now. Are they going to allow... David, what's the last comic book you have read where you have seen drug use of any type featured?
in front and center.
Just in general, Dave, I read a lot of comic books. I don't think I've ever seen drug used in the you know what? I'm going to say ever.
Yeah.
And I'm not
I have to
taking
agree.
I'm not taking Vertigo into account, and I'm not taking Black Label into account.
Yeah.
But even for a second, let me put those into the mix. Even with what I remember, besides Hellblazer, I don't remember drug use being used as a story element.
The only time that drug use ever became prevalent in comics was before this in the 70s when you had the iconic Speedy cover of Green Arrow, his sidekick, doing, I think it was heroin. And the cover of his, oh my God, my sidekick is taking drugs. That is probably...
But that also sounds like a pandering agenda, though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This right here is probably taking that drug line story and making it part of the story,
Well, it's
and
all-
not making it part of an agenda.
Also, it's very taboo.
Yes.
When you're looking for a vein and you're tying off your arm, I mean, that's heavy.
That's heavy.
And it's taboo. And that's why it works so well in Hellblazer, without a doubt.
Well, the thing that makes me crack up too is like, so you have all these disturbing elements, and take it into context. This is 1988, and you're right now, the comic book industry is absolutely just controlled by characters like Superman, Spider-Man, all the characters of Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, front and center, the capes are saving the world. You have this dark story, and you would expect, at the time, as a comic book reader, oh, our hero is going to be this knight in shining armor.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, you get John Constantine.
Yeah.
And it just makes it even more disturbing because the way Constantine approaches things, and the way they set him up in this issue right away, he's just a matter of fact. He's the perfect detective.
He's the
perfect
just a
detective.
guy doing his job. And whatever his job requires of him, he will do in order to get it done.
Yeah.
David, I had forgotten how flawless the inaugural issue was. Like,
Well,
I being a Hellblazer fan, a lot of these stories just kind of all merge and become one in your mind when you try to recall stories. So going back and reading the very first issue, it's amazing, absolutely amazing how well this story is fleshed out. The story of John Constantine is fleshed out in a singular issue. I mean, Delano does truly a remarkable job bringing this character to life. I mean, John's world, the immediate threat, allusions to his past, his personality, the rapport with other characters are all fully established in the very first issue. There's no shitty cliffhangers. There's no like, oh, but we're going to save this part of his story for later. Even though there are those sense of continuation, absolutely, because this is an ongoing series. For the most part, you feel a sense of closure in this first issue. There isn't that messiness that we feel so often in comics of the 90s and even today, where a lot of times these issues just feel like advertisements for the next issue.
Yes.
Hey guys, read the next issue. Well, what are you going to do in this issue? Never mind that. Read the next issue.
Next issue.
This is a full picture, a full story, fully realized with closure. That's why this story works so well. And ultimately, that's why I decided just to focus on issue number 1, because you don't need to read or discuss issue 2 to fully appreciate what this very first issue does for Constantine. And of course, being 30 plus years after the release of the first issue, the legacy of John Constantine.
And I know a lot of people who have looked back at this issue especially like this run, The Original Sin, they find it very controversial, number one, because of a lot of things. Well, especially when you get to the point when the way he treats the guard, when he treats essentially the mute, like, you could basically really say John skirted the line on treating the guy very racist, like.
Really? I didn't get that. I just felt
And a lot
like
of people though do see that.
he
like,
was slow, right?
Yes.
But the thing is he was dead.
yeah,
He was a zombie.
That's when you find out, oh, he's a zombie. So it's supposed to make him okay.
When's the last time there was an intelligent zombie?
Yeah. Oh, it's this DC Comics, Mike.
David, I understand people's, from someone who's not actually paying attention to what they're reading, I can see where they may draw those
lines,
those conclusions. Oh, look, it's racist. The black guy's dumb. But also, Papa Midnight is extremely intelligent, who's introduced in the next page, and he's the one who made this zombie.
Yeah. And that's why, as I said, when you look at it,
those are just sensitive people, David. Fuck 'em.
people might say what I'm going to say is wrong next, but arguably this comic is up there in my opinion when it comes to comics that deserve the 100 level, because when
what do you mean
it,
the 100 level?
When we ever score something,
yeah.
this would legitimately make me say, no, there's 100. You can't look at this and say, how is this not seminal? How is this not history altering as a title?
Absolutely, Dave. This changed
the game.
This changed the game in a big way. Absolutely. To me, this whole entire thing we're talking about, the fleshing out of this world and all the things that they did, this is one of the most important elements to a graphic novel. The establishing of the world and its rules. And I want to stress that it's rules. The idea that governs the cosmology in a broader scope. How do these aspects interact with each other? You have to establish the rules. And they did that from the very beginning. We know the stakes and the players, and we know what each of them are capable of. We're dealing with the world of magic. We're dealing with the world of magicians. We're dealing with a very gritty, grounded reality as well at the same time, delving into real social issues like drug abuse, like addiction, which you could look at the demon possession as a bit of a drug allegory. So from the very beginning, they're establishing their rules so that readers know exactly what they're getting into. Mm-hmm. And I will say, you made this bold absolutist statement a few moments ago pertaining to, I forgot what it was now, but I'm going to say the exact same thing for Lost Art. I will say straightforward narratives. Straightforward narratives like this. No shitty flashbacks.
Nothing.
Linear storytelling is a lost art. They were able to tell a story from beginning to end in a rather straightforward method.
Yeah.
There was no tricks. There was no subverting expectations. There was no unnecessary attention on what if I fool them? What if I hold back this mystery? No, the attention was 100% on telling an intriguing story. Because guess what? At the end of the day, the only thing that will matter to your readers is whether or not your story is good. Nothing, you're subverting doesn't hold up. When you subvert people's expectations and you try to pull the rug out from under them, that only works once.
Yeah.
That only works once. And sometimes it doesn't work at all.
And I think that the problem also is a lot of writers nowadays wait for the cliffhanger. They always have to end on a cliffhanger instead of focusing on...
Or they're working. Let's say you have a 6-issue run, David, and they're working for that reveal. So there's 4 issues, all not really delving to the stuff that's important, like fleshing out your immediate story. No, those first 4 issues are dedicated towards working toward that reveal that's going to blow everyone's mind.
That's going to blow everyone's mind. Here, it's less about the reveal and more about let's set the stage and the story.
Yes.
The story is about this demonic spirit that is on the loose, and you open up the issue with it showing the chaos it brings, right? Then you bring in John Constantine. You introduce him as a character. You introduce the problem, which is his friend Gary. And then the whole bug incident. John Constantine takes the case, goes and figures out, oh, I have to go talk to Papa Midnight to figure this out.
Yeah, so every plot point you're going through,
it leads to another part.
A story reveal.
Yeah.
Something that we need in order to understand the purpose of the story, its intent, and the context.
But take it even a step further, though, Mike. I mean, not only are you figuring out the theme, but then along the way, you introduce you basically introduce aspects of your character to show them what type of person is he. You go from Papa Midnight to all of a sudden the scene with the dead prostitute and the mystery woman in Constantine's life, right? And you have this illusion that John Constantine screwed her over and now she's stuck in the afterlife. Why? Because of him. You set the example that John Constantine is a man who might try to who might be a hero, but he's not perfect. He's not Superman.
He's like the rest of us.
He's the rest of us.
Sometimes we make bad decisions.
He makes bad decisions and people pay for it.
Yeah.
And then so you have that, and then you go and put John into the confrontation with Menmoth, where he has to go to the church, and then he sees the priest, and he sees Menmoth, and what happens? John Constantine doesn't win. John has to run away because he's dealing with a being that is 100 times more powerful and more dangerous than he is.
You touch on a lot of great things because look how much was introduced in simply the first issue. You have your lead characters, Chaz, Papa Midnight, Gary Lester, and of course John Constantine. Then you have the antagonists, Menmoth, and then you have the potential fallout of a storyline we haven't quite seen, but there are allusions to with was it Emma?
Emma.
There's so much going on in these 40 plus pages that honestly should be used as an example for today's writers.
And would you see
how
this,
to get a story out properly in a small amount of time?
Would you see this story being done today? Absolutely not.
Cy Spurrier came the closest.
Spurrier came the closest, but I mean, like, Spurrier just also still, as I've always stated, artists and writers today focus too much on basically that. I need that splash page. I need that moment in my book to hook the audience. If you read this issue, is there a splash page? Nope. There's not a single splash page.
Well, that's why when you, and this isn't an insult towards Spurrier
Absolutely
or
not,
his
no,
work
yeah.
because we loved his Hellblazer run, but just as an example here, what was I saying a few moments ago about working towards your reveal? Much of his storyline was geared towards it was about working towards that reveal. Who is old man John Constantine?
Exactly. What's his game, right? Tom Taylor fans.
David, didn't that frustrate you a little bit? Even though you love Spurrier's run, one thing you said is, can we just get a complete story?
A complete story. Give me a complete story. That's it. That's the thing that I found really frustrating is Spurrier came the closest to giving us an old feeling Hellblazer title.
Yep.
And then, then Tom Taylor came across and everyone thinks it's God's gift is the rise and fall of Constantine.
I'm pleading the fifth.
And yes, plead the fifth, but that's the thing. You look at the audience. You got to read the room, unfortunately. And I read the room in comics.
And we understand writing styles change. And right now, people are all about the reveal.
Yes.
TV is like that. Comic books follow suit. In fact, in a lot of ways, comic books has tried to mimic television beats quite a bit over the last, maybe 8-9 years. I've seen that. Yeah. There used to be a difference in the mediums, in the ways of writing, just like novels are very different than screenplays and TV. Imagine if novels decided to change their structure beat for beat to fit TV. It would be something entirely different. And that's what the comic books have slowly evolved into, they kind of resemble television more than anything, which isn't a bad thing, but it does make me miss the more succinct, tidy stories. And that's ultimately what Delano is able to do with this very first issue. Give us a tidy story, which essentially ends up being a taste. He's getting us strung out, David. Here's your taste. The first taste is free. I'm going to strap this this heroin kit around I'm going to make a tourniquet. There we go.
Tourniquet.
And I'm going to inject you with some Constantine. So a little bit more on the writing style, and then we're going to wrap this discussion. One thing that rarely holds up when it comes to older comics is the writing style and the maturity level. That's not the case with Hellblazer. In fact, it's quite surprising how much this title still holds up. The content is mature, void of the silliness that can be found in some of the older comic books of the time. And I think that's a testament to Delano's effort to craft a timeless story about a man who's a lot more like us than the typical comic book character.
Yes.
Some titles are designed to be escapism, mere fantasy. Nothing wrong with that. But Hellblazer is a different beast. It's a refraction of our own reality, taking issues of the self and exploring parts of the human condition. Mm-hmm. Constantine is the reflection in the mirror that many of us shy away from. And you see aspects play a crucial part in the very first issue as well. Ultimately, this is probably the reason why the series lasted decades.
And think about it, Mike. I mean, the difference between this Hellblazer, the very first initial issue of Hellblazer, compared to DC Rebirth or the New 52 version of Hellblazer, Constantine in here, if it was today, Constantine would easily have just gotten rid of Menmoth by pulling out a spell out of his ass and saving the day. Why? Because that's how people think Constantine is. Just pull out a magic spell, he'll be fine. He'll pull out a wand and basically blast away Menmoth.
How it works?
And that's not how it works. That's not how it should work. Because
can you imagine Sean Constantine with a wand?
But, dude, they came close with DC 52 and Rebirth.
Expelliarmus!
Yeah.
Wait, what does Harry Potter say? Did I say it right?
Obliviate?
Obliviate. That's the crossover we need, David.
Harry Potter
meets John.
Dude,
well, technically,
technically we got it with Books of Magic.
Yeah, technically that is what it is.
Because that's what it is. It's Harry Potter.
Yeah,
it's a John Constantine.
That's true.
But like, when you take a look at this issue, this is what encapsulates John Constantine.
Yeah.
And what I always tell people, what frustrates me with Constantine writers nowadays is they don't touch on that. They don't realize that Constantine's a human being.
Hold on one second. Okay. Yep.
But that's what they don't understand, that Constantine's a human being.
Yeah, he's just like the rest of us.
He's like the rest of us.
But that's why he's fun to watch, because he's like us, but with a little bit of the
swagger.
Yeah, there's still a sense of escapism to his stories, but for the most part, it is grounded in a reality similar to ours.
Yeah.
But not quite the same.
Not quite the same.
Outside of structure and intent, there is a lyricism to the narration or the prose that really works. A pondering or an attitude of reflection that helps us understand Constantine. I mean, there's a line here. Let me see if I can find it that I thought was amazing. You know, being a writing nerd here. Let's see if I can find it. There's a line here that I didn't realize Delano is such a poetic writer. He says, it takes 5 hours as the sun wobbles down onto the horizon, spilling its blood across the plain like a wounded animal. That's what much of the first issue is filled with. Just a type of lyricism to his prose.
Yeah.
And I like it because that also is a lost art, because continually today we're told not to be, lyrical in your writing. Don't do this, don't do that. And a lot of our narration nowadays in some of our comic books feel like they're written by a 12-year-old. Frank
Sad,
Miller.
isn't it? Frank Miller.
Except for Sin City, which is perfect. But
Because he knew what he was writing.
Yeah, so there is a maturity not just to the content, but to the writing style as well. And as we had alluded to, David, the art is extraordinary.
Oh, yeah.
And
I love it.
I'm just going to leave it at that because we have already gone into that. Now, just a little bit of background, David, because you might not be aware of this either. Maybe you are. So DC Comics had a horror imprint, which I was familiar with, but I didn't realize it has such a long history.
Oh, yeah.
It dates from the 50s and goes all the way until Vertigo replaced it.
Yes. Because the horror comics, horror,
not
horror comics are something that I've always grown up with. It's actually what got me into comics when I was a kid. My mom always bought Tony, my brother, Spider-Man, Batman, right? For me, I always gravitated to like the Challengers of the Unknown. Even like the Tales of Suspense.
What about House of Secrets?
House of Secrets, stuff like that.
House of Mystery.
Those were the titles that actually I gravitated towards because they were the fun titles.
Oh, me too. I mean, same. I mean, I had to sneak them. I had to put them, inside of Spider-Man or
because there's
or
some
Batman, and
there
then
were some things in there that children should not see.
Oh, my mom would not have ever let me. She knew some of the darker stuff I was reading. I benefited as a child from the ignorance of that generation. They thought comic books were for kids.
For kids, yeah.
Little did she know I was jerking it to Vampirilla.
Yeah.
So disgusting.
or even Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah.
Tales from the Crypt was
You were
classic.
jerking it to Tales of the Crypt?
Oh, there was some really choice comics back then that dealt with the horror aspect that were borderline adult. That were spank bank.
Listen, nothing wrong with that. Okay, so what primarily killed DC's horror titles for the most part, even though they were successful, were two things. The first issue was the DC implosion, in which titles with marginal or low sales, which is happening now.
Yes.
And they mentioned House of Secrets, The Witching Hour, Secrets of Haunted House, and Doorway to Nightmare were canceled en masse. The other was the simple fact that the 80s horror comic books were no longer fashionable.
Yes.
Marvel had ended their horror line in the 70s, and by 1982 and 1983, the horror titles were not selling very well at all, and that's the reason for the cancellations. But at the end, DC Comics horror titles would prove more successful than those published by Marvel in the 70s. And they mentioned specifically House of Mystery, Weird Mystery Tales, Doorway to Nightmare, and then, of course, Hellblazer. And was Swamp Thing on the horror imprint as well?
Swamp Thing was back in the 70s, but then...
So to this day, the DC comic books of the 70s still have a following. Fond memories. My House of Secrets, House of Mystery, Swamp Thing, and the Phantom Stranger.
Yes.
Were all part of the 70s.
We're all part of the 70s. It was in the 80s when they decided to take Swamp Thing and try to put him with the capes, as it were. And they tried to basically put him in titles that, oh, look, Swamp Thing and Superman saving the day together, and taking this character who was originally a monster comic and making him into a hero.
Yeah.
And that was because, at the time, Swamp Thing, you had the movie come out that,
the TV show, I thought.
And the TV show.
Oh,
remember, the movie came out during the 80s, too.
I never had any interest in seeing that.
Adrian Barbeau and freaking...
I know you and Steve love it.
Yeah, that see-through silk shirt. That was amazing. But
Such a pervert.
I am. But also the TV show. The TV show was big, and they had to change Swamp Thing into a superhero.
Yeah. I love the history behind Hellblazer's title, or the Hellblazer title.
Oh yeah, dude. So many people in Hellblazer. If you look at the writers gallery that tackled Hellblazer back in the day, I'm like, it's an absolute gallery of historical writers.
It's a shame that we don't have really a horror imprint with DC.
They tried, especially with DC's 52. They tried to bring back Dal H for Hero, which was an old horror imprint. They tried to bring in Hellblazer, but
they've done a few things with DC Black Label. Stephen King's son, I forgot his name. I think he did a couple things, but they're just one and done. You know, it's not like something ongoing, which is very strange to me because we live in a day and age that horror is one of the most marketable genres, whether it be movies, books, TV shows. And I find it strange that DC is not trying to capitalize on the horror audience.
Yeah. It's a shame because like a lot of those horror comics, I think they're the Hill imprint.
Oh yeah, that's what it is.
The
You're
Hill
right.
imprint.
Yep.
I loved them. They were really creative, and they harken back to the old 1970s type of storytelling for horror comics. But just to give everyone an idea, Mike, of like the writers gallery that was in Hellblazer, just Hellblazer. You have Jamie Delano, you have Garth Ennis, you have Eddie Campbell, you have Paul Jenkins, you have Warren Ellis, you have Grant Morrison, Neil Gaiman, Brian Azzarello, John Smith, Darko Macken, Mike Carey. All these guys are like considered like historic. Andy Daigle, Peter Milligan.
Yep.
And then I'm so happy.
These are iconic names.
I'm so happy they actually added his name to notable writers was Cy Spurrier.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, they did.
Well, they
because
better.
Spurrier is a really great writer.
What about Tom Taylor? Is he on there for Rise and Fall?
You know what's hilarious? No.
Yeah, because honestly, dude. Okay, so the problem with Rise and Fall, there's lots of things, but I'm talking about continuity. See, Cy Spurrier was smart with what he did with his continuity. He did this whole, not time travel, but he did this whole multi-universe thing, and it left a question mark. Like, what Constantine is this? Is this the one we've been following for, 300 plus issues? Well, it could be. And because of the way he wrote it and he chose the time frames he chose to write within, that's why people view this as part of the ongoing Hellblazer storyline. Whereas Rise and Fall is excluded because no one knows where this takes place and whether or not it's actually connected to the greater Hellblazer continuity. There are so many inconsistencies when it comes to DC canon as well, as we had discussed. It seems like Tom Taylor has no concept of who Satan or the devil is, or Lucifer. He seems to think they're all one character, and we all know as DC fans that they are different characters.
Yes.
So there's a lot of
there's a lot of problems with
So I don't think that title is ever going to be bunched up in like an omnibus as part of the Hellblazer storyline lineage. There we go. But Spurrier will his will.
Spurrier's will, and I'm very happy that they threw his name in there. But it makes me crack up that basically Tom Taylor is like the odd man knocking out at the door saying, "Excuse me, can I come in?" And everyone's like looking at me like, "No, you don't belong in this room."
Yeah. Okay, Dave. So, I mean, fantastic issue. I had forgotten how much of this first issue was used in the Constantine TV series, as well as the Keanu Reeves movie. Yeah. There are big plot elements that were adapted into the movie and the TV show.
Oh yeah, Original Sins is a very important title for Constantine. It's kind of like why everyone constantly says, if you want to know about the character John Constantine, you have to at least read Original Sins.
Yeah. So, upon further reflection, Dave, I'm going to give this first issue a 99%.
Oh, come on, Mike. You know you want to.
Listen,
join me.
It's damn near perfect, David, but I'm also too close to this.
You're too close.
So I'm trying to be objective. I'm trying to be fair. So I'm going to go with 99%. What about you, David?
Oh, you already know where I'm going. I stick by my guns on this one. It's a seminal issue. It's such an important issue for comic book history that it deserves to be 100. It's one of those milestone issues. Can't say anything else about it.
There's nothing wrong with it.
There's nothing wrong with it.
Maybe I should give it 100%.
Because you can be critical. You can be critical about it, and you can basically... That's why I brought up the whole thing that people say, but look at the imagery. It's so dated because it's borderline controversial and racist.
Oh,
and
come
I'm
on.
like going, no, you have to look at it for what it was trying to do.
The people that say that are borderline idiots.
Yeah. You have to look at what it was trying to set. It's setting up a world of Hellblazer where it's dark, it's very squeaky, it's uncomfortable. That's the whole point. This isn't a Superman title. Hell, it's not even a Batman title. Batman could not survive in the Hellblazer world. He'd probably go insane. He'd probably go.
Yeah. Well, Dave, this does bring us to the end of our discussion. We have pretty much dissected the hell out of this very first issue. I'm not sure when we'll be back with the second issue because we do have a list of discussions mapped out for the foreseeable future. But as soon as we have a gap in our regular programming, we will jump right into the second issue, maybe even the second and third issue. We'll see. I also want to remind people that we have a Patreon page. If you go to patreon.com/RaymanDigital and pledge at least $1, you'll gain access to our Oblivion Bar show, which is essentially a show just like this one, but it is more casual, and we consider it our pre-show where we kind of shoot the shit. We always talk about John Constantine things or related things pertaining to the world of Constantine, but we're more casual, and we get warmed up before we start the regular show. And sometimes they're 10 minutes long, sometimes they're 20 minutes long, sometimes they're 30 minutes. So you get all of that for $1. If you like our show, if you like me, $1 is nothing.
Nothing.
Patreon.com/RaymanDigital. Thank you, David.
Thank you.